It's Desm101 back with another video, and this time we're going to be taking a close look at the Sega Saturn arcade racing wheel. Now, I made racing games for the Sega Saturn video a while back, and a few people recommended that I should try it out. And it's a pretty interesting peripheral on the Saturn. In addition to that, I wanted to also highlight and take a look at the rest of the racing games on the Sega Saturn that we had not talked about previously. So there's quite a lot of games that I was surprised to find out about, and while they might not be the best racing games on the Saturn, they are still quite a lot of fun, and there's a lot of interesting obscure games to learn about here. The steering wheel controller for the Sega Saturn, called the Arcade Racer, was released for the system in 1995. It was originally actually designed for a release on the Sega Genesis and was a carryover from that original design. It's a fully analog controller with 2 switches on the back for R and L, and all 6 face buttons are on the top, 3 on each side. You can set specific adjustments to the height of the steering column as well as the angle, giving you a bunch of options for how you would like it set up. And it is quite flimsy at first when you feel it. It does not have a lot of weight to it, and it's a basic plastic construction. You can find the lock switch on the back here, which will allow you to unlock it or set it in the position that you would like it to stay in. I also recommend, if you're thinking about getting one of these, to be careful to check out the quality of the cord, because I've noticed that these cords tend to get stored kind of poorly and you might have some input issues when trying to use it. One of the challenges of using the Saturn Arcade Racer was getting a good surface to mount it onto, so you can't just put it on your lap. The best way to use it is also not to use a TV tray. You would need some kind of solid surface, like a table, or in my case I was using empty milk crates stacked up too high. Sega claims on the box that the game is compatible with all the racing games on the Saturn, although there does appear to be a couple which are not compatible. Impact Racing and Road Rash are 2 examples. They mapped the L and R on most of the racing buttons to up and down on the menus for most of the games, allowing you to get navigation. And it also is compatible with other games that use the analog controller. So even games like Vatlava, which is a vehicle combat game, are compatible with the racing wheel. For this video, I did not actually get the chance to try every racing game on the Saturn with the Arcade Racer, but I did test it with the majority of the games that it was intended for, such as Virtua Racing, Daytona USA, and Sega Rally Championship, in addition to Wipeout and Wipeout XL. Because of the somewhat flimsy and cheap feel of the Arcade Racer, it kind of throws you off at first, and you really have to give it a chance and practice with it for a while to kind of let it grow on you and get accustomed to it. I found that it seems like the distance between left and right is fairly too far in some games, so during points with a lot of sharp turns, you're jerking back and forth very quickly. It would have been nice if they included an option to set this so that the range wasn't so far from one end to the other. Once you spend enough time playing through a few games and practicing, you really start to get the hang of it, and it feels natural, particularly with the first-person modes in games like Wipeout, Wipeout XL, and Daytona USA and Sega Rally Championship. I found that I had the most difficulty with Virtua Racing, and couldn't ever meet the level of performance that I would normally have with a control pad on this game. So I think you will probably get the best out of it if you have this similar type of option by using a CRT to plug into and kind of be centered right in front of it. I think that's the best way to kind of get the most out of the experience. And in that regard, I do actually really recommend this peripheral if it's in good shape. And now let's take a look at some more racing games on the Saturn, starting with the motorcycle games, of course. And that means we need to talk about Hang On GP, which is another title in the Hang On series, which was originated in the arcade and had an early release on the Sega Genesis. Unfortunately, this title doesn't fare quite as well as that game does. This game suffers from clunky controls which are hard to get the hang of, especially with turning, and somewhat ugly graphics. It does get better once you get the hang of it, and the first person mode is actually pretty decent compared to some other games. I can't really recommend this one as I think there's better motorcycle racers on the system past this. Up next we have Manx TT Superbike, which is actually a port of an obscure arcade game, also from Sega, and this one looks and plays a lot better. This is one that I actually do recommend. It's a solid racing experience. It doesn't have a ton of tracks, but with what you have here, it's done pretty well and it plays great. So this one is actually recommended. Check it out. And for the last of the motorcycle racing games, we have Road Rash, which is basically a port of the arguably superior 3DO version of Road Rash. And this is pretty much very similar and a good port of that game. It's definitely one of the best Road Rashes in my opinion. The Saturn did not get the sequel that showed up on the PS1, so that's also worth mentioning. But this one plays pretty well, and I do recommend it. A good one to pick up for the system. And continuing on with the rest of the racing games, we have another title from Electronic Arts, The Need for Speed, and this is another one that was ported from the 3DO version. However, this one is superior to that, even though it's a port. So this one added some more modes, like a Grand Prix mode where you get to race against multiple opponents instead of just one, and it runs a bit better. So the game seems a bit more peppy and the racing seems faster. So this is the preferred version of this game to me. In Japan, this game came out as Nissan Presents Drivin GTR. It's essentially the exact same game, however it has Nissan cars instead, and so all the models have been updated to reflect that as well as the images. But it's essentially the same game with a new coat of paint. Impact Racing isn't so much an actual racing game as it's more of a vehicular combat game that takes place in a race-like format. So it makes me think of Crash and Burn, which I talked about on the 3DO on another video. And basically, you're really mostly just counted for how many kills that you make. And the game itself, while it's not terrible, it's also not great either. It feels like a pretty shallow game and a bit meddling. I don't really recommend it, but if you like old school car combat games, you might want to check it out. And here we have what, in my opinion, is one of the biggest oddities on the Sega Saturn, and this is Sonic R, which is a racing game with Sonic and characters from the series, which should be an easy slam dunk for Sega, but the controls are just so horrible. It's really sluggish to control and figure out what to do, and on top of that, the stages themselves are baffling in the design, where it's super easy to go off the course of the track and get lost, so you don't really know exactly where you're supposed to go sometimes. It's just a really confusing mess of a racing game. It has some charm to it, but I personally could not get into this. And here we have some more jank with Hi-Octane Racing, a poorly performing game, and from what I understand, the Saturn version is the worst version of this game out there. So this one just, it has some neat design to it. You can even pick one of the cars that looks like a Back to the Future DeLorean, but man, I couldn't even stand to play this game for too long. It just performed so bad, and the controls are weird. You have to press up to drive forward. It's one of those kind of games, so I really can't recommend it. For this video, it was one of the worst ones I played, so pass on this one. Here we have another title from EA, and this time it's a surprisingly good game with Nascar 98. This is another one that was released on multiple systems. However, this one makes a very good appearance on the Sega Saturn. Competent racing, a good variety of tracks, and the gameplay is really solid. The graphics aren't the best, but this was easily one of my favorite games to play for this episode. Highly recommend this one. Here is Touge King the Spirits 2, the sequel to Touge King the Spirits, which was released in the West as High Velocity, and this one was exclusive to Japan, so it never got a version for the West. And it's another solid racer from Cave, the renowned shoot-'em-up developer. The game is pretty challenging, a little bit tough to get the hang of, definitely more of a simulation style game, but it is definitely worth checking out if you like these mountain style racing games. And here's another title that really struggles on the Saturn. It's Hardcore 4x4, and this one, it just chugs along at a really slow frame rate. You can tell that they were pretty ambitious trying to incorporate the physics of the suspension along with the road terrain, but the outcome is just very poor for gameplay wise. This also got released on the PS1, where it plays much better, so this seems to be one of those cases where they probably developed it first on the PS1 and then tried to put it on the Saturn and just really struggled, resulting in something that just isn't very satisfying to play. Avoid this one. Next is Highway 2000, which is also known as Wangan Dead Heat in Japan, And this one plays like a Ridge Racer game. I wouldn't really go as far as calling it a Ridge Racer clone, but it definitely is an arcade style racing game opposed to a more simulation style race. The original Japanese version has a mode where you have a female co-pilot that you try to impress while you drive, and the Wangan Dead Heat series actually continues on the Saturn, only in Japan, with the same theme where you're trying to impress females with your driving. Overall, this was generally an impressive and competent game, and one that I would definitely recommend to check out on the Sega Saturn. A very fun racer. So here is that sequel, Wangan Trial Love, and this one, as you might have noticed, the previous games and a bunch of racing games on Saturn were developed by Genki, but this one was by Pack-In-Soft, and immediately this one threw me off because the controls are very weird. The D-pad is actually used for controlling the gear shift, and the L and R buttons control the steering wheel, which, trying to play this was like trying to learn to walk again if you switched your arms and your legs around. It was just ridiculous. And it does have a simulation mode where you try to impress girls, upgrade your car and stuff like that, but it is very dense with Japanese, and all the menus are in Japanese too. And here we have Drift King Shutoko Battle 97, and this one leans heavily into the simulation style of racing. This is another one from Genki, and it also had a PS1 version. The PS1 version got released in the West as Tokyo Highway Battle, but the Saturn version was not released in the West. This was another solid racer on the system, and might be more akin to something like Gran Turismo on the Sega Saturn. It was pretty good. Not great, but good. Here's another interesting one. It's Street Racer Extra, and this is one that was released in Europe and Japan, but not in the US. So you might have heard of Street Racer from the Sega Genesis game, but this one's a little bit different, and it offers a little bit different perspective. It's actually considered by some to be superior to the PlayStation 1 version, but that might be arguable. And while this game is colorful and quite a cool looking game, the gameplay does get very repetitive in terms of the tracks just feel very claustrophobic. Each track takes place in a very small area, and it ends up making you feel like you're just constantly turning the whole time, which started to make me dizzy after about 20 minutes or so. Here's a PAL exclusive Formula Karts Special Edition, and this is a very unique game in that it's a simulation style version of kart racing, and it does look pretty great. Another interesting thing is that a few years later, Sega actually made a kart racing arcade game, which may or may not have been inspired by this one. And while it does look pretty impressive, the gameplay is actually really tough. The steering was nearly unusable for most of the time for me with most of the racers, and so maybe with the steering wheel it's better, but playing it with a normal pad was extremely difficult for me, so it's hard to recommend this one other than a curiosity. This is 04 Champ Doozy J Type R. Now that's a mouthful. And what is this game? And well, basically what this is actually a dating simulator with drag racing portions. And you can play just the drag racing part by itself, but the main intent here is for the dating sim. So another one of those themes where you're trying to drive to impress girls. And this one is another one that's hyper focused on the shift. So most of the controls revolve around how well you can shift. And it's pretty tough. So unless you're a big fan of drag racing and you can read Japanese, I would say you can probably pass on this one. And here is yet another game developed by the ever-prolific Genki. They were definitely the guys to go to for your racing game on the Saturn. And this is Initial D. And it's quite notable for being the only Initial D game for a console, while being based on a well-known anime and having an arcade game. This one's pretty interesting for that reason. And it is one of the better racing games on the Saturn. If you like those mountain racing games, this one is pretty good. Lots of twisting turns, and it's one-on-one racing at its finest on the Saturn. Definitely worth checking out. And for our last one here today, we have another oddity with race driving. One of the earliest polygonal 3D games released in arcades, and if you're an old dinosaur like me, you probably remember this one pretty well, playing it back in the day with its deluxe cabinet that you would sit down in. And it would cost you upwards of $1 to play each time, lasting you about a minute or two. Now, this one comes to us courtesy of Time Warner Interactive, and it's the same guys who brought us Virtual Racing on the Saturn. And while this isn't super spectacular, it is a fascinating version of the game with a ton of additions and improved performance from the arcade game. So if you like the original, you'll definitely want to check this one out, even though it is just an oddity. You might have a lot of fun reliving some of those old early arcade days and have a fun time trying out some of these new modes that they have here. So, finalizing this video, I wanted to leave you with my thoughts and a tier list on the games, on the obscure racing games for the Saturn. So, no S tier games, but Road Rash, Manx TT Superbike, Need for Speed, Highway 2000, and Initial D are all A tier in my opinion, worth checking out. B tier, NASCAR 98, Touge King Spirits 2, Drift King 97, aka Tokyo Highway Battle, and Street Racer are all B tier, also worth your time, with some issues one way or another, but still worth checking out. In the C tier, we have Hang On, Impact Racing, Formula Karts, and Race Driving, which are more curiosities and oddities, but could still be worth your time. D were the ones I didn't personally like, Sonic R and Wangan Trial Love. Both of these are ones that I just couldn't get the hang of, and so I didn't really agree with them. In E, we have Doozy J, which was the drag racing game, and it's just not for me. It doesn't have much racing to it. And in F tier, just our Hi-Octane and Hardcore 4x4, which are nearly unplayable. So that concludes the rest of the racing games on the Sega Saturn. What are your thoughts? Did you have some favorites from this list? Are you going to go check some of these out? I did have a few to recommend, and they are pretty fun, but some of them are a little odd. I definitely like the arcade racing stick as well. So if there's any others that I missed, please let me know. I always want to check out more games. And I appreciate you guys for sticking around to the end of the video. Thank you so much.